He grabbed me by the throat, but I'm the 64-year-old janitor with a military past the millionaire never saw coming. Those words still echo in my mind, sharp as the cold steel of a bayonet. The shock didn't come from the grip itself, but from how little it registered with the family I worked for. Maybe you're finishing your rounds, checking the cameras, or closing the building while the world sleeps. Tell me, where are you watching from, and what time is it there? I promise, today's story will touch your heart. My name is Margaret, 64 years old, with weathered hands that have scrubbed more floors than I care to count. These hands once held an M16 rifle in the desert heat of Kuwait, steady and sure. Now they grip mop handles and dust rags in a penthouse suite overlooking Lake Michigan. My back aches most mornings, curved from decades of bending over industrial sinks and toilet bowls. The navy blue uniform I wear hangs loose on my frame, too big, because they ordered it in the wrong size and never bothered to replace it. I've been invisible my entire life, it seems. Invisible to my drill sergeants who barked orders without ever seeing the scared farm girl from Illinois underneath. Invisible to my ex-husband who left me for a younger woman while I was deployed overseas, claiming I was never really there anyway. And now, invisible to the Morrison family, whose $30 million fortune built on tech investments and cryptocurrency trading couldn't buy them basic human decency. The penthouse sits on the 42nd floor of Trump Tower in Chicago, all glass and marble and cold steel surfaces that reflect nothing but emptiness. Every morning at 5:30, I take the service elevator to the top, my keys jangling against my hip like dog tags from another lifetime. The sound echoes in those sterile hallways where my footsteps are muffled by Persian rugs worth more than most people's cars. Richard Morrison made his money early, dot-com boom, then pivoted to real estate, then Bitcoin when it was pennies on the dollar. Now his portfolio spans everything from municipal bonds to offshore accounts in the Cayman Islands. His wife, Patricia, inherited oil assets from her daddy's Texas fortune. Together, they're worth more than some small country's GDP. But wealth, I've learned, doesn't make you wealthy in character. That Thursday morning started like any other. I unlocked the main door at dawn, reset the alarm system, and began my rounds. The coffee was brewing in the kitchen, imported beans from Guatemala that cost more per pound than I make in a week. Patricia liked her eggs over easy. Richard preferred his oatmeal with organic blueberries and a drizzle of Manuka honey. Their son, Bradley, 28 and still living off Daddy's dividends, usually stumbled out around noon, demanding whatever was left. I was dusting the mahogany shelves in Richard's study when it happened. The room smelled of leather-bound books he'd never read and Cuban cigars he'd never smoked, just props in his performance of success. His trading screens flickered with green and red numbers, Bitcoin prices dancing like heartbeats across multiple monitors. The man probably made more money while brushing his teeth than I'd see in 6 months. "Margaret!" His voice cut through the morning silence like a blade. "What the hell is this?" I turned to see him holding up a crystal wine glass, or what was left of one. The Waterford crystal lay shattered on his mahogany desk, red wine soaking into investment documents worth millions. My heart sank. I'd been cleaning around his workspace earlier, trying not to disturb the papers detailing his latest acquisition, a chain of luxury hotels in Miami Beach. "I'm so sorry, Mr. Morrison. I must have bumped the table when I was—" "You must have what?" His face reddened, veins bulging in his neck. The man who could buy and sell entire city blocks stood there shaking with rage over a glass that probably cost him less than the interest he earned in the time it took to break it. "Do you have any idea what those documents were?" "The Meridian Hotel deal? $300 million in assets, and now they're stained with wine. Sir, I can print new copies. I can—" That's when it happened. His hand shot out faster than my military training could react to, fingers closing around my throat with surprising strength. Not enough to really hurt me. I'd been choked by bigger, meaner men in basic training, but enough to make his point. his manicured fingers pressed against my windpipe, his gold Rolex cold against my skin. "You stupid old woman," he hissed, his breath hot and sour. "Do you understand what stupid costs me?" I could have broken his grip. 20 years in the Army teaches you things about leverage and pressure points that don't just disappear with age. I could have had him on the ground in 3 seconds, gasping for air and wondering what hit him. But I didn't. Because I needed this job. Because at 64, starting over isn't a choice when you've got nothing saved for retirement except the measly pension from a military that used you up and spit you out. So I stood there, feeling his fingers around my throat, and nodded. "I understand, sir." He released me and turned back to his screens, already forgetting I existed. "Clean this mess up, and don't let it happen again." The worst part wasn't the physical contact. I'd survived worse in combat zones where the enemy actually wanted me dead. The worst part was Patricia walking in 5 minutes later, seeing me on my hands and knees picking up glass shards, and asking if I had remembered to pick up her dry cleaning. Not, "Are you okay?" Not, "What happened?" Just annoyance that her silk blouses might still be hanging at the cleaners. That night, I sat in my tiny studio apartment in Rogers Park, 43 floors and a world away from their penthouse. My apartment was furnished with cast-offs from Goodwill and furniture I'd built myself, skills learned from my father, who worked construction until his back gave out. The walls were thin, and I could hear Mrs. Chen next door watching her Korean soap operas, the emotional dialogue bleeding through the drywall. I stared at myself in the bathroom mirror, touching my throat where his fingers had pressed. The skin wasn't even red anymore, but the memory lingered like a phantom pain. I'd been grabbed by enemy soldiers in Kuwait, by drunk GIs who thought they could take advantage of a woman in uniform, by my ex-husband during our worst fights. But somehow, this felt different. This felt like the final proof that I'd become exactly what I'd feared most: disposable. My phone buzzed. A text from Bradley Morrison. "Don't mess up again or you're out." Not even the decency of a conversation, just a cold digital dismissal, sent while he was probably lounging in the infinity pool on their rooftop deck, spending his trust fund on cryptocurrency day trades that either made him thousands or lost them just as quickly. His entire existence funded by algorithms in Daddy's portfolio, never once working a real job or understanding what it meant to earn a dollar through sweat. I'd been working for the Morrison family for 8 months, ever since answering their Craigslist ad looking for discreet household management. The salary was decent, better than the office buildings I'd cleaned downtown, where security guards treated janitors like potential criminals, and office workers left their worst messes for us to handle. The Morrisons promised something different. "We value loyalty," Patricia had said during my interview. "We treat our staff like family." Family. The word had meant something to me once. I'd grown up on a corn farm outside Rockford, where family meant everybody pitched in during harvest season, where my mama would make enough fried chicken to feed whoever showed up for Sunday dinner, whether it was cousins from 3 counties over or neighbors whose crops had failed. Family meant looking out for each other, even when times were tough. But I'd learned that rich people use words differently than the rest of us. When they say family, they mean convenient. When they say loyalty, they mean shut up and do what you're told. When they say we value you, they mean until we don't. I should have seen it coming. The warning signs were there from the beginning, small humiliations that built up like sediment in a riverbed. The way Patricia would hand me her dirty dishes without looking at me, as if I were a piece of machinery designed solely for cleaning. The way Richard would discuss his business deals on speakerphone while I worked around him, never considering that I might understand what he was talking about, or that I might have opinions about his ethics. Like the time he bragged to his lawyer about shorting renewable energy stocks just before lobbying to have environmental regulations relaxed. Or when he laughed about charging his hotel guests extra fees for Wi-Fi while paying his housekeeping staff minimum wage. The man who preached about free market capitalism while using every tax loophole his high-priced accountants could find. But it wasn't just the moral bankruptcy that wore me down. It was the constant reminder that I didn't matter. The way they'd discuss vacation plans to their houses in Aspen and Martha's Vineyard while I wiped down their countertops, never once considering that I might like to travel somewhere besides the Jewel Osco for their grocery shopping. The way they'd complain about their investment returns being down 3%, while I calculated whether I could afford both my blood pressure medication and my electric bill in the same month. Have you ever felt that way? Like you're performing your life instead of living it? Standing in someone else's house, surrounded by their wealth and success, wondering if you'd made different choices. Would you be the one with the crystal wine glasses instead of the one cleaning them up? The loneliness was worse than the disrespect. I'd been alone since my divorce 15 years ago, when Tom decided he couldn't handle being married to someone who'd seen combat. "You're different," he'd said, as if that was my fault instead of the Army's for sending me places where 18-year-old kids learned what human beings look like when they've been blown apart by roadside bombs. Hard, he called me, distant. Maybe I was hard. Maybe watching your friends die in a foreign desert hardens you in ways that don't wash off in civilian showers. Maybe learning to kill people before they kill you changes something fundamental in your soul. But I'd tried to soften myself for him, tried to be the wife he wanted instead of the woman I'd become. It didn't matter. He left anyway, taking a half our savings and our dog, leaving me with an empty house and a Purple Heart that couldn't pay the mortgage. My daughter Lisa wouldn't talk to me anymore, not since I missed her college graduation for a deployment I couldn't get out of. She'd sent me pictures via text, her in her cap and gown, smiling with Tom's new wife, the woman who'd stepped into the role I'd vacated. "Thanks for not being here," she'd written. As usual. I tried to explain that military service was about sacrifice, about serving something bigger than yourself. But how do you explain duty to someone who thinks duty is just another word for abandonment? How do you tell your adult daughter that you missed her childhood not because you didn't love her, but because you loved your country enough to fight for it? Now, at 64, I was cleaning toilets for people who'd never sacrificed anything more meaningful than their preference for imported coffee. People whose children called them every day, whose marriages survived because they'd never been tested by anything harder than choosing between the Mercedes and the BMW. The Morrison household ran on schedules as precise as military operations, but without any of the honor or purpose. Richard left for the Chicago Board of Trade at 7 sharp every morning, his Armani suits pressed to perfection, his Italian leather briefcase stuffed with reports on municipal bond yields and cryptocurrency mining operations. Patricia had her yoga class at 9, followed by lunch with her charity committee, a group of wealthy women who raised money for causes they'd never personally encountered. Bradley was the worst of them all, a grown man who'd never held a real job, living off quarterly distributions from his trust fund while pretending to be an entrepreneur. His latest business venture was something called TechFlow Solutions, a consulting company with no clients, no employees, and no clear purpose beyond providing tax write-offs for his daddy's accountants. He'd follow me around the apartment sometimes, making comments about my work that felt designed to remind me of my place. "Make sure you get the baseboards in the guest bathroom," he'd say, even though I'd been cleaning baseboards since before he was born. "My mom's book club is coming over, and she'll notice if anything's dirty." The implication was clear. Failure wasn't just unprofessional, it was personally embarrassing to them. My mistakes reflected on their status, their image, their carefully constructed narrative of success and superiority. I wasn't just their employee. I was a potential threat to their reputation. One morning in late September, I arrived to find Richard in his study, pacing back and forth while talking animatedly to someone on his Bluetooth headset. His trading screens showed nothing but red numbers. Bitcoin had crashed overnight, wiping out millions in paper profits. His voice carried the particular panic of a man watching his net worth evaporate in real time. "No, no, no," he was saying. "The Shanghai markets don't open for another 3 hours. We can still hedge our position in the futures market." I tried to slip past him to the kitchen, but he held up one finger. The universal signal for, wait, I'm more important than you are. So I stood there, invisible, listening to him lose more money in 10 minutes than I'd earn in 5 years. "Margaret," he barked when he finally ended the call. "Coffee, now, and make it strong." "No, please, no thank you." Just an order barked at a subordinate whose feelings didn't register on his emotional radar. I made his coffee, a special blend that cost $40 a pound, served in a cup that probably cost more than my monthly rent, and set it on his desk next to reports detailing his latest acquisition, a portfolio of commercial properties in downtown Detroit that he was planning to flip for luxury condos. The gentrification play, he'd called it when bragging to his investment club. Buy low-income housing, kick out the residents, renovate for young professionals, guaranteed returns. I thought about my sister Carmen, who'd been priced out of her neighborhood in Milwaukee when developers discovered that working-class communities could be transformed into trendy districts for people with tech jobs and trust funds. She'd lived in the same apartment for 12 years, raised her kids there, built relationships with neighbors who became chosen family. Then, her rent doubled, then tripled, until she was forced to move 40 minutes outside the city to a place where the buses didn't run and the grocery stores carried expired food. But to Richard, displacement was just data on a spreadsheet. Poverty was a market opportunity. Human suffering was an acceptable cost of doing business, as long as the returns justified the investment. That morning, as I dusted his bookshelf, I noticed a new addition to his collection, The Art of War by Sun Tzu. He'd never been to war, never seen the aftermath of real battles, never had to explain to a 19-year-old soldier why his best friend wouldn't be coming home. But he displayed the book like a trophy, as if understanding strategy and tactics was something you could buy at Barnes & Noble, instead of something you learned by surviving situations where the wrong decision got people killed. The irony wasn't lost on me. Here I was, a combat veteran who'd actually lived the art of war, cleaning the house of a man who thought he understood conflict because he'd read about it in a leather-bound edition that matched his office decor. Do you know what real war teaches you? It teaches you that strength isn't about domination. It's about endurance. It teaches you that victories are often invisible, measured not by what you gain, but by what you refuse to lose. It teaches you that the loudest voice in the room is usually attached to the person who's never been truly tested. Richard Morrison had never been tested. Not really. He'd inherited his seed money from his father's machine shop empire, turned it into digital assets during the dot-com boom, and ridden market waves that lifted all boats. His success was timing and luck and access to opportunities that people like me never see. But he wore it like personal virtue, as if his bank balance was proof of his moral superiority. The breaking point came on a rainy Thursday in October. I was cleaning the main bathroom, scrubbing imported marble tiles that cost more per square foot than I paid in monthly rent, when Patricia burst in without knocking. She was crying, actual tears streaming down her surgically enhanced cheeks, holding her phone like it contained devastating news. "Margaret," she sobbed, "I need you to do something for me, something important." My heart softened despite myself. For a moment she looked vulnerable, human, stripped of the armor of wealth and privilege that usually separated us. Maybe this was it, the moment when family would finally mean something real. "Of course, Mrs. Morrison. What do you need?" "I need you to lie to the police." The words hit me like a physical blow. "Ma'am? Bradley was in an accident last night, a hit and run. He was drinking, but he's saying he wasn't driving. He's saying you dropped him off at the club and picked him up. He's saying you can vouch for his whereabouts." I stared at her, my mind racing. Bradley had been out God knows where, probably drinking and driving his daddy's Porsche like he owned the roads. Someone had been hurt, maybe killed, and they wanted me to provide a false alibi to keep their precious son out of prison. "Mrs. Morrison, I can't." "We'll make it worth your while," she interrupted. $50,000, cash. Just tell them you drove him. One little conversation and you can retire comfortably." $50,000. More money than I'd ever seen in one place, enough to get a decent apartment in a safer neighborhood, enough to maybe visit my daughter Lisa and try to rebuild what we'd lost. All I had to do was lie to police officers who were just trying to do their jobs, just trying to get justice for whoever Bradley had hurt. "No," I said quietly. Her tears stopped instantly, replaced by something cold and calculating. "Excuse me?" I said no. I won't lie to the police. I won't help cover up whatever Bradley did. Patricia's face transformed, the vulnerable mask slipping away to reveal something uglier underneath. "Do you understand what you're throwing away? Do you understand how easily we can replace you?" "Yes, ma'am, I understand perfectly." That evening, after finishing my shift in silence, I sat in my apartment thinking about integrity. In the military, we had a saying, "Character is what you do when nobody's watching." But I'd learned something else over the years. Integrity is what you do when everybody's watching, when the consequences are real, when doing the right thing costs you everything you can't afford to lose. I thought about my father, who'd worked construction his entire life without ever cutting corners or using substandard materials, even when the bosses pushed him to finish faster and cheaper. "Your name is on everything you touch," he used to say. "Make sure it's something you can be proud of." I thought about my mother, who cleaned houses for rich families during the Great Depression, who never once stole so much as a dinner roll despite feeding 5 children on whatever scraps she could find. "Poor doesn't mean dishonest," she'd tell us. "Hard times don't change who you are. They reveal it." And I thought about my fellow soldiers, men and women who'd died protecting something they believed in, who'd made the ultimate sacrifice because they understood that some things matter more than personal comfort or safety. $50,000 would have changed my life, but it wouldn't have changed who I am. The next morning, I arrived at work to find the atmosphere completely transformed. Patricia wouldn't look at me. Richard's jaw was set in a hard line, and Bradley was nowhere to be seen. The police had apparently visited the night before, asking questions about the hit and run that had left a 62-year-old grandmother in intensive care with multiple fractures and internal bleeding. "We've decided to make some changes to our household management," Richard announced while I was preparing his morning coffee. "We're bringing in a professional service. Your last day will be next Friday." No explanation, no severance, no acknowledgement of the 8 months I'd spent keeping their perfect life running smoothly. Just dismissal, delivered with the emotional warmth of a corporate downsizing announcement. But I felt something unexpected. Relief. For 8 months, I'd been living in a moral compromise, taking money from people whose values disgusted me, telling myself it was just business. Now the decision was being made for me, and I was grateful. "I understand," I said. "I'll finish out the week." That afternoon, while cleaning Richard's study, I overheard a phone conversation that changed everything. He was talking to his lawyer about the accident, discussing strategies for defending Bradley that went far beyond anything I'd imagined. "The witness statements are inconsistent," Richard was saying. "If we can discredit the old man who saw the car leaving the scene, we might be able to create reasonable doubt. What about his medical history? Any dementia, memory issues we can exploit?" My blood ran cold. They weren't just trying to cover up Bradley's crime. They were planning to destroy an elderly witness, to attack a man's credibility and mental capacity just to protect a rich kid who couldn't handle the consequences of his choices. "And the victim," Richard continued. "What do we know about her? Any criminal history, drug use, anything that might suggest she was at fault?" "Mrs. Elena Vasquez," I learned from the news reports I looked up later. 62 years old, grandmother of 4, worked double shifts at a diner in Pilsen to help pay for her granddaughter's college tuition. She'd been crossing the street after her evening shift, carrying leftover soup for her diabetic neighbor, when Bradley's Porsche ran a red light and sent her flying 30 feet across the intersection. She was still in a coma, her family keeping vigil at her bedside while the Morrisons hired private investigators to dig up dirt that might shift blame to the victim. I realized then that I wasn't just working for selfish people. I was working for moral monsters, people whose wealth had insulated them from consequences so completely that they'd lost any connection to basic human decency. That night, I made a decision that would have surprised the 20-year-old farm girl who'd enlisted in the army, the 30-year-old soldier who'd survived Kuwait, or the 40-year-old divorcee who'd learned to live alone. I was going to fight back. My military training hadn't just taught me about weapons and tactics. It had taught me about intelligence gathering, about patience, about waiting for the right moment to strike. Over the next week, while finishing my duties with the Morrison family, I started paying attention to things I'd previously ignored. I noticed that Richard left his computer unlocked when he went to the bathroom, his email account open, and displaying correspondence with shell companies in the Cayman Islands. I noticed that Patricia kept detailed records of their charitable donations, small amounts that qualified for tax deductions while generating positive publicity, a fraudulent foundation that existed only on paper. Most importantly, I noticed that they kept hard copies of sensitive documents in Richard's study, papers they were too paranoid to store digitally where hackers might find them. Documents detailing bribery payments to city officials who'd approved their hotel construction permits. Documents outlining plans to evict elderly tenants from rent-controlled apartments. Documents proving that their renewable energy investments were actually shell companies designed to collect government subsidies while producing no actual clean energy. On my final Thursday, while they were all out of the apartment, Richard at a business lunch, Patricia at her spa appointment, Bradley presumably meeting with his legal team, I made copies of everything, not to sell or blackmail, but to ensure that justice had a fighting chance. Friday morning arrived gray and cold, Lake Michigan churning with October storms. I cleaned the Morrison penthouse one last time, taking pride in leaving everything perfect. My military training had taught me to finish strong, to leave things better than I found them, even when the people I was serving didn't deserve my best effort. At noon, Richard handed me my final paycheck and a termination letter that cited budget constraints as the reason for my dismissal. No mention of my refusal to lie for Bradley, no acknowledgement that I was being fired for refusing to compromise my integrity. Just corporate language designed to protect them from any potential legal challenges. "We appreciate your service," he said, the words hollow as campaign promises. I wanted to laugh. Service. As if cleaning their toilets was equivalent to serving my country in combat. As if being their invisible employee was anything like the oath I'd taken to protect and defend the Constitution. Instead, I nodded politely, gathered my few personal belongings from the supply closet I'd used as a makeshift office, and headed for the service elevator one last time. But I didn't leave empty-handed. Tucked inside my jacket were copies of documents that would interest several different law enforcement agencies, evidence of tax fraud, bribery, tenant intimidation, and charity scams. Evidence that the Morrison family's fortune was built not just on smart investments and good timing, but on systematic exploitation of legal loopholes and outright criminal activity. I'd spent 20 years in the military learning about honor and sacrifice and standing up for what's right, even when it's hard. Now, at 64, I was finally ready to put those lessons into practice. The next morning, I walked into the FBI field office on West Roosevelt Road and asked to speak with someone about financial crimes. The agent who interviewed me, a serious young woman named Detective Rodriguez, listened to my story with increasing interest. When I produced the documents, her eyes widened. "Mrs. Sullivan," she said, "do you understand what you're showing me here?" "Yes, ma'am. Evidence of federal crimes committed by people who think their money makes them untouchable." 3 months later, the news broke. Richard Morrison arrested on charges of tax evasion, bribery, and operating fraudulent charities. Patricia Morrison charged with conspiracy and money laundering. Bradley Morrison finally facing vehicular assault charges for the hit and run that had left Mrs. Vasquez with permanent disabilities. The investigation, revealed a pattern of corruption that stretched back years, involving dozens of city officials, contractors, and business partners. The Morrison family empire, built on cryptocurrency gains and real estate speculation, crumbled as federal agents seized assets, froze accounts, and unraveled the web of shell companies that had hidden their crimes. I watched the news coverage from my small apartment in Rogers Park, feeling something I hadn't experienced in years: satisfaction. Not revenge, satisfaction. The knowledge that justice sometimes works, the truth eventually surfaces, that ordinary people can still make a difference when they refuse to stay silent. Mrs. Vasquez recovered enough to attend the trial, walking slowly but proudly to the witness stand where she described the accident that had changed her life forever. Bradley Morrison, the spoiled rich kid who'd never faced real consequences, broke down crying as she spoke. His parents' money couldn't protect him from the weight of what he'd done. The FBI agent who'd handled my information sent me a letter thanking me for my cooperation and noting that my military service record had been a factor in evaluating my credibility as a witness. For the first time in years, someone had seen my past as an asset rather than a liability. But the most meaningful validation came from an unexpected source. Mrs. Vasquez's granddaughter, Maria, tracked me down through social media and sent me a message that brought tears to my eyes. Thank you for standing up for my grandmother when no one else would. Thank you for proving that there are still people who care about right and wrong. My grandmother always said that angels come in unexpected forms. You were ours. I never considered myself an angel. I was just a tired old janitor who'd reached a point where staying quiet felt worse than speaking up. But maybe that's what angels are, ordinary people who choose to do something extraordinary when the moment demands it. The months after the Morrison family's arrest were the loneliest of my life, but also the most peaceful. My savings account was nearly empty. My job prospects were limited by age and a criminal investigation that had made me radioactive to Chicago's wealthy families. But for the first time in decades, I could look at myself in the mirror without feeling ashamed. I found work at a small medical office in Lincoln Park, cleaning examining rooms and organizing supply closets for a fraction of what the Morrisons had paid me. But Dr. Martinez treated me with respect, remembered my name, asked about my weekend plans. The work was honest, the environment was ethical, and my conscience was clear. On Christmas Eve, I was walking home from the clinic when a woman approached me on the sidewalk. Latina, about my age, walking with a cane but moving with determination. "Are you Margaret Sullivan?" she asked. "Yes, ma'am." "I'm Elena Vasquez." We stood there in the December snow, two women who'd been damaged by the same rich family's selfishness, two survivors who'd found the strength to keep fighting. "I wanted to thank you," she said, "for telling the truth when it was hard." "I wanted to thank you," I replied, "for surviving when it would have been easier to give up." We talked for an hour on that cold sidewalk, sharing stories about our grandchildren, our fears, our hopes for the future. She'd been a house cleaner too before the accident, working for families who'd treated her as poorly as the Morrisons had treated me. Now she was starting college at 62, studying social work, determined to help other women find their voices. "We're stronger than they think," she said as we prepared to part ways. "We're stronger than we think." The Morrison family trials lasted another 6 months. Richard got 8 years in federal prison, Patricia got 5, and Bradley got 3 years plus 10 years of probation, his driver's license permanently revoked. Their fortune, built on decades of crime and corruption, was largely seized by the government to pay restitution to their victims. I testified at each trial, wearing the best clothes I could afford, telling the truth simply and clearly. The defense lawyers tried to discredit me, to suggest that a 64-year-old janitor couldn't be trusted to remember complex financial documents or understand sophisticated business arrangements. But my military service record spoke for itself. 20 years of exemplary conduct, multiple commendations for integrity under pressure, a Purple Heart earned in actual combat. The jury looked at this gray-haired woman in a discount store dress and saw someone who'd proven her credibility in ways that mattered. On the final day of Bradley's trial, as he was led away in handcuffs to begin his sentence, he looked at me across the courtroom. For just a moment, I saw something other than arrogance in his eyes. Maybe remorse, maybe just fear of what prison would be like for a rich kid who'd never faced real hardship. I didn't feel sympathy for him, but I didn't feel hatred either. Just a grim satisfaction that Mrs. Vasquez would receive justice, that other potential victims would be protected, that power and privilege hadn't been enough to escape the consequences of deliberate cruelty. After the trials ended, I did something I'd been planning for months. I drove to Milwaukee to see my sister Carmen, who'd been evicted from her apartment by developers who'd used tactics similar to Richard Morrison's playbook. We hadn't spoken in 2 years, not since I'd been too broke and proud to help when she'd asked for loan money. "I'm sorry," I told her, sitting in her new kitchen in the apartment 40 minutes outside the city. "I'm sorry I wasn't there when you needed me." "You're here now," she said. "That's what matters." We spent a week together, two sisters in their 60s trying to rebuild what poverty and pride had damaged. She told me about her new job at a community center, helping families navigate social services and housing assistance. I told her about the trials, about standing up to people who'd thought their money made them untouchable. "Mama would be proud," Carmen said, "standing up for what's right, even when it cost you everything." From Milwaukee, I drove to Indianapolis to see my daughter Lisa for the first time in 3 years. She was married now, had 2 children I'd never met, a whole life I'd missed while working jobs that kept me too busy and too broke to visit. The reunion was awkward at first. 20 years of missed birthdays and broken promises don't heal overnight. But she introduced me to my grandchildren, Emma, 6, and James, 4. And something in my heart cracked open like an egg. "Grandma Maggie fought bad guys," Lisa told them when they asked about my past. "She was a soldier, and then she was a hero." I'm not sure about the hero part. Heroes make difficult choices look easy, inspire others through their courage and sacrifice. I was just a stubborn old woman who'd gotten tired of being invisible, who'd reached a point where staying quiet felt worse than speaking up. But maybe that's heroic enough. Maybe standing up for what's right, even when you're scared, even when it costs you everything, is the kind of heroism the world needs most. Now, at 65, I'm living in a small cottage in Galena, Illinois, where my military pension and Social Security are enough to cover my needs. I volunteer at the local VA hospital, helping younger veterans navigate the bureaucracy that can be as challenging as any battlefield. I read to children at the library, tend a garden that actually belongs to me, and sleep peacefully at night. Sometimes tourists visit Galena to see the historic homes and antique shops, wealthy families from Chicago looking for weekend retreats in quaint small towns. When they come into the cafe where I have coffee most mornings, I watch them carefully, not with hatred, but with understanding. Most rich people aren't criminals like the Morrisons. Most are just ordinary people who've had extraordinary luck, who've worked hard but also benefited from advantages they didn't earn. But wealth insulates you from consequences, and insulation can become isolation from the moral demands of living in a society where everyone needs to matter. The Morrison case became a landmark in federal prosecutions of financial crimes, cited in law journals and business ethics courses. Their downfall proved that even sophisticated criminals with unlimited resources could be brought to justice when ordinary people found the courage to speak truth to power. But for me, the most important outcome was personal. For the first time in my adult life, I'd aligned my actions with my values, refused to compromise my integrity for financial security, chosen truth over comfort. Would I make the same choice again, knowing the cost? God, yes, every single time. Mrs. Vasquez sends me Christmas cards from Chicago, where she's working as a victim's advocate, helping other families navigate the criminal justice system. Her granddaughter Maria graduated from college with a degree in social work. Inspired by her grandmother's resilience and our shared belief that ordinary people can create extraordinary change, The FBI keeps my contact information on file in case they need my testimony for related cases. Detective Rodriguez, who's been promoted since our first meeting, told me that my cooperation led to investigations of 12 other wealthy families engaged in similar criminal enterprises. "You started something," she said during our last conversation. "People aren't as afraid to come forward anymore." Maybe that's my real legacy. Not the military medals gathering dust in my drawer, not the Purple Heart I earned in a desert that most Americans have forgotten, but the proof that invisible people matter, that quiet voices can still be heard when they speak the truth. Do you know what I learned in my 65 years of mistakes and victories, compromises and standoffs? I learned that integrity isn't about being perfect. It's about being consistent. It's about making choices that align with your deepest values, even when those choices are inconvenient or costly. It's about understanding that some things matter more than personal comfort, that some principles are worth fighting for regardless of the consequences. I learned that strength isn't about never falling down. It's about getting back up every single time. It's about surviving in a world that often treats ordinary people as disposable, maintaining your dignity when others try to strip it away. Most importantly, I learned that it's never too late to become the person you were meant to be. At 64, I finally found the courage to fight back against people who thought their wealth made them untouchable. At 65, I am finally living a life that honors the values my parents taught me and my military service protected. Here's what I want you to understand, wherever you are, whatever job you're working, whatever family situation is wearing you down. You are not as powerless as you think. You are not as invisible as they want you to believe. Your voice matters, your choices matter, your integrity matters. The wealthy and powerful count on ordinary people staying quiet, accepting mistreatment, prioritizing security over justice. They've built systems designed to make resistance seem impossible, to convince working people that speaking up will only make things worse. But sometimes, one person refusing to stay silent can bring down an empire built on lies. Sometimes, one witness telling the truth can protect dozens of future victims. Sometimes, one old janitor with nothing left to lose can prove that justice isn't just for people who can afford expensive lawyers. Have you ever found yourself in a situation where you had to choose between your values and your security? Have you ever worked for people who treated you like furniture, invisible until something needed cleaning or fixing? Have you ever wondered if speaking up would matter, if anyone would listen to your voice? Let me tell you about Sarah Chen, the night shift security guard at Morrison Tower, who became an unexpected ally in my fight for justice. Sarah had been watching the elevators and monitoring the building's cameras for 3 years, invisible to most of the wealthy tenants who passed her desk every day. But Sarah saw everything, including the night Bradley Morrison stumbled into the garage at 2:47 a.m., his Porsche's front bumper crumpled, his hands shaking as he tried to park straight. Sarah had pulled up the security footage 12 different times in the weeks after my confrontation with the Morrison family, studying Bradley's face, his clothes, the damage to his car. She'd written down the timestamp, made notes about his behavior, saved screenshots on her personal phone. When the FBI investigation began, Sarah was the first person to step forward with evidence. "I knew that boy had hurt someone," she told me over coffee 6 months later. I could see it in his eyes, the way he kept looking over his shoulder. Guilty people can't hide from cameras, and they can't hide from conscience, even rich guilty people. Sarah's courage inspired others. Miguel Santos, the valet who parked cars in the Morrison Tower garage, remembered Bradley screaming at him to keep his mouth shut about the car and threatening to have him deported if he talked to anyone about what he'd seen. Miguel had been in this country for 15 years, had 2 children born here, worked 60 hours a week to support his family. But the fear of deportation had kept him silent until Sarah showed him that speaking up was safer than staying quiet. "They use our fear against us," Miguel explained when I met him at the federal courthouse during Bradley's trial. "They think because we're not rich, we don't deserve truth. But Mrs. Sullivan, You showed us that truth is stronger than money. Truth is stronger than fear. The prosecution built their case around testimony from people like Sarah and Miguel and me, working people who'd been invisible to the Morrisons until we became inconvenient to their crimes. The defense spent millions trying to discredit us, hiring private investigators to dig through our personal lives, our financial records, our social media posts. They found my divorce papers, tried to paint me as a bitter ex-wife who harbored resentment against successful families. They discovered Sarah's mother had been treated for depression, suggested that mental illness ran in her family and affected her reliability as a witness. They uncovered a parking ticket Miguel had never paid, implying that someone who doesn't follow traffic laws can't be trusted to tell the truth about traffic accidents. But the jury saw through their tactics. These were working people themselves: a teacher, a mechanic, a nurse, a retired police officer, a grocery store manager. They understood what it meant to need your job, to fear retaliation, to feel invisible in a world where money talks louder than truth. They understood that our credibility came not from perfection, but from the courage to speak up when speaking up would cost us everything. The conviction of the Morrison family sent shockwaves through Chicago's wealthy communities. Suddenly, housekeepers and gardeners and security guards weren't just invisible employees. They were potential witnesses to crimes that rich families thought their money could hide. Suddenly, treating working people with basic human dignity wasn't just morally right, it was legally prudent. Dr. Martinez, my employer at the Lincoln Park Medical Clinic, started a support group for domestic workers who'd witnessed financial crimes but were afraid to come forward. Margaret's courage gave permission for others to speak their truth, she explained to a reporter from the Chicago Tribune. She proved that ordinary people can fight extraordinary corruption and win. The support group met every Thursday evening in the clinic's waiting room. Women mostly, ranging in age from their 20s to their 70s, representing every ethnic community in Chicago. They shared stories that would make your blood boil and your heart break. Stories of wage theft, sexual harassment, threats of deportation, physical abuse, and financial crimes that their wealthy employers thought they were too stupid or too scared to understand. Rosa Martinez had cleaned houses for 30 years and witnessed at least 6 different families engaging in tax fraud, money laundering, and insurance scams. "I speak 4 languages," she told the group during one of our meetings. "I have a degree in accounting from Guatemala, but they see me with a mop and think I don't understand numbers." Jennifer Washington had worked as a nanny for political families who'd used campaign funds for personal expenses, claiming their children's private school tuition and family vacations were legitimate political activities. "I kept their calendars," she said. "I knew the difference between campaign events and personal parties, but they figured I wouldn't know the laws they were breaking." Maria Gonzalez had been a housekeeper for a federal judge who'd taken bribes from defense attorneys, scheduling lighter sentences for clients who could afford to pay extra for favorable treatment. "I heard the phone calls," she whispered, still afraid even months after the judge's arrest. "I cleaned the office where he counted the money, but who was going to believe a woman who doesn't speak perfect English against a federal judge?" Each woman's story was different, but the pattern was the same. Wealthy people committing crimes while assuming that their employees were too powerless, too afraid, or too invisible to hold them accountable. And for years, that assumption had been correct. Until it wasn't. The support group grew from 8 women to over 40 within 6 months. Dr. Martinez had to move our meetings to the community room at the local library, then to the basement of St. Teresa's Catholic Church, when even the library couldn't accommodate our numbers. Women drove from suburbs across Cook County, some bringing their adult daughters or sisters who'd had similar experiences. We created an informal network of accountability that stretched across Chicago's wealthiest neighborhoods. Women who'd been isolated in their individual experiences of mistreatment discovered they weren't alone, weren't crazy, weren't powerless. Together, We developed strategies for documenting suspicious activities, understanding legal protections for whistleblowers, and connecting with law enforcement agencies that specialized in white-collar crime. The FBI established a dedicated hotline for domestic workers reporting financial crimes. Detective Rodriguez, who'd been promoted to head the white-collar crime division partly based on her success with the Morrison case, told me that calls to the hotline increased 400% in the year after our support group started making headlines. "Your story changed everything," she said during one of our quarterly check-ins. "Not just for law enforcement, but for working people who finally realize their voices matter." But the most profound change wasn't in law enforcement statistics or news headlines. It was in the women themselves. Rosa Martinez enrolled in English classes at the community college, determined to improve her language skills enough to testify effectively if she ever witnessed crimes again. Jennifer Washington started studying criminal law online, planning to become a paralegal specializing in white-collar defense cases. Maria Gonzalez, despite her fears, provided testimony that helped convict the corrupt federal judge and earned her a commendation from the Department of Justice. "We were invisible because we agreed to be invisible," Rosa explained during one of our meetings. "But Margaret showed us that invisible people see everything, and seeing everything is power." The support group evolved into something more formal, the Domestic Workers Justice Coalition. We lobbied for stronger legal protections for household employees, better enforcement of wage and hour laws, and expanded whistleblower protections for workers who report criminal activity by their employers. Our biggest victory came 18 months after the Morrison convictions, when the Illinois General Assembly passed the Household Workers Protection Act. The law established new requirements for written contracts between domestic workers and their employers, created penalties for wage theft and retaliation, and provided legal immunity for workers who report criminal activity in good faith. Governor Pritzker invited me to the signing ceremony, acknowledging that the legislation had grown out of the courage of ordinary workers who refused to accept extraordinary injustice. Standing on the steps of the state capitol, surrounded by women who'd found their voices because I'd found mine, I felt something I'd never experienced during my military service, the satisfaction of protecting people who couldn't protect themselves. But the work wasn't finished. The Morrison case had been unusual because their crimes were so extensive and well documented, because they had been arrogant enough to keep written records of their illegal activities. Most wealthy families were smarter, more careful, better at hiding their corruption behind layers of lawyers and accountants and shell companies. That's when I decided to write this book, not just to tell my story, but to provide a roadmap for other working people who find themselves in similar situations. How to document suspicious activities without breaking the law. How to protect yourself from retaliation while building a case for law enforcement. How to find the courage to speak up when speaking up might cost you everything. The book manuscript is sitting on my kitchen table as I record this story, 300 pages of practical advice mixed with personal reflection. My literary agent, yes, I have a literary agent now, which still amazes me, thinks we can get it published by next spring. The advance money will be enough to fund the Domestic Workers Justice Coalition for at least 2 years. I never imagined at 64 that I'd become an author, an activist, a public speaker, traveling to conferences and universities across the country. I never imagined that my story would resonate with people who'd never worked as domestic help, but understood what it meant to feel invisible, powerless, taken advantage of by people with more money and status. Last month, I spoke at Harvard Business School to MBA students studying corporate ethics. The professor who'd invited me introduced me as living proof that moral courage can triumph over economic power. But sitting in that classroom, looking at young faces that reminded me of Bradley Morrison, I was more interested in planting seeds of empathy than celebrating victories. "Most of you will become wealthy," I told them. "Some of you will become very wealthy, and when that happens, you'll have employees, housekeepers, gardeners, nannies, security guards, drivers. People whose names you might not remember, whose stories you might not think to ask about. I want you to remember this. Those people see everything. They understand more than you think. And they deserve your respect, not because they might someday testify against you, but because they're human beings whose dignity doesn't depend on their bank balance. One student raised her hand. But Mrs. Sullivan, didn't you essentially spy on your employers? Didn't you violate their privacy and trust? I'd been asked this question dozens of times by reporters, prosecutors, defense attorneys, and critics who thought I'd crossed a moral line by copying those documents. My answer was always the same. I violated their trust in my willingness to cover up crimes. I violated their expectation that I'd stay silent while they hurt innocent people. If that's the kind of trust and privacy you want to protect, then yes, I'm guilty of violating it. The room was quiet for a moment. Then another student asked, "Would you do it again?" "Every single time," I said, "and I hope you would too." The speaking engagements generated enough income to allow me to cut back on my cleaning work, though I still keep the job at Dr. Martinez's clinic. I like the routine, the physical work, the daily reminder of where I came from and why this fight matters. Plus, Dr. Martinez has become more than an employer. She's become a friend, someone who treats me as an equal, despite the difference in our education and economic status. "You know what I learned from working with you?" she asked me recently while we were restocking supplies in an examination room. "I learned that character isn't determined by what you studied or how much money you make. It's determined by what you do when you're tested. Most people are never really tested. You were tested every single day for 8 months, and you never compromised who you are." That conversation reminded me of something my drill sergeant used to say during basic training. The military doesn't build character, it reveals it. Working for the Morrison family had revealed my character too, eventually. It just took me longer to recognize what I was seeing. The anniversary of Bradley Morrison's conviction falls next week. 3 years since the accident that started everything. Mrs. Vasquez and I have plans to meet at the cemetery where she visits her husband's grave every month. She wants me to meet him, she says, even though he died 5 years before Bradley's drunk driving changed her life forever. "Eduardo would have liked you," she told me last Christmas. "He always said the best people are the ones who know what it means to suffer, who use their suffering to prevent other people's suffering. That's what you did, Margaret. You used your pain to protect the rest of us." I think about Eduardo Vasquez sometimes, a man I never met who worked construction for 40 years, raised 4 children, and died of a heart attack while helping his neighbor repair a leaky roof. A good man whose widow was nearly killed by a spoiled rich kid who thought his money made him untouchable. A good man whose granddaughter is now studying to become a social worker because she was inspired by her grandmother's fight for justice. The ripple effects of moral courage spread farther than we can imagine. Elena Vasquez's granddaughter Maria doesn't just want to be a social worker. She wants to specialize in helping domestic workers navigate the legal system. Sarah Chen, the security guard who provided crucial testimony in the Morrison case, is studying criminal justice at night while working full-time, determined to become a police detective focused on white-collar crime. Miguel Santos, the valet who testified about Bradley's threatening behavior, used his share of the witness protection funds to bring his parents from El Salvador to Chicago. Mrs. Sullivan proved that truth is stronger than fear, he told me at his parents' citizenship ceremony last year. I want my children to grow up in a country where that's always true. The Morrison family's forfeited assets funded a victim compensation program that helped dozens of families who'd been damaged by their crimes. The elderly tenants who'd been evicted from rent-controlled apartments received settlements that allowed them to find new housing. The small business owners who'd been cheated by fraudulent contracts got their money back with interest. Mrs. Vasquez received enough compensation to stop working double shifts at the diner, allowing her to focus on her recovery and her advocacy work. But money couldn't undo all the damage. Mrs. Vasquez still walks with a cane, still experiences chronic pain, still has nightmares about the sound of screeching brakes that came too late. The elderly witness the Morrison family tried to discredit died 6 months after the trial, his family convinced that the stress of the investigation accelerated his decline. The three families evicted from their homes to make way for luxury condos never fully recovered their sense of security, despite the financial settlements. That's what rich criminals never understand about the harm they cause. Money can compensate for financial losses, but it can't restore trust, can't heal trauma, can't give back the years of life lost to fear and displacement and physical injury. The Morrison family's wealth had insulated them from understanding the full cost of their choices until it was too late to make different ones. Richard Morrison will be eligible for parole in 5 years. His lawyers have already filed 3 appeals, claiming prosecutorial misconduct, inadequate defense representation, and judicial bias. Patricia Morrison was released after serving 3 years of her 5-year sentence, rewarded for good behavior and cooperation with ongoing investigations into other wealthy families' criminal activities. Bradley Morrison completed his prison sentence last month and is living in a halfway house in Milwaukee, participating in an alcohol treatment program and attending community college classes paid for by a trust fund. His lawyer managed to protect from asset forfeiture. Do I think they learned anything from their experience? I'm not sure. People who grow up wealthy often develop a different relationship with consequences than the rest of us. They learn that money can solve most problems, that lawyers can make most troubles disappear, that social status can protect you from the worst outcomes. Even prison might not teach lessons to people who've never had to live with the permanent consequences of their choices. But I've learned something too. My responsibility isn't to ensure that other people learn the right lessons. My responsibility is to keep trying to teach those lessons, to keep speaking up when I witness injustice, to keep supporting other people who find the courage to fight back against corruption and abuse. The Domestic Workers Justice Coalition now has chapters in 12 states and has helped pass similar legislation protecting household employees' rights in California, New York, and Massachusetts. We're working on a federal bill that would extend whistleblower protections to all domestic workers and create a national database for reporting wage theft and criminal activity by household employers. Last month, I received a letter from a young woman in Houston whose family had employed her grandmother as a housekeeper for 20 years. My grandmother never talked about her work, she wrote, but after reading about your story, she told me about things she witnessed, financial crimes, domestic violence, child abuse, that she was too afraid to report. She's 83 now, too old to seek justice for herself. But she wants you to know that your courage gave her permission to finally tell someone what she saw. Letters like that arrive every week from domestic workers across the country who've found the strength to speak up about crimes they've witnessed, from employers who've examined their own treatment of household help and made changes, from law enforcement officers who've been inspired to take white-collar crime more seriously because of the Morrison case. The most moving letter came from a woman in Seattle whose teenage son was killed by a drunk driver from a wealthy family. The driver's parents hired expensive lawyers and private investigators to blame my son for his own death, she wrote. But I remembered your story, and I found domestic workers who'd witnessed the family's crimes. The FBI investigation that started with your inspiration revealed tax evasion, money laundering, and charity fraud. The driver's family lost their fortune, and my son's killer couldn't afford expensive lawyers for his appeal. He's serving his full sentence because you proved that working people's voices matter. Now she's starting her own organization to connect families of drunk driving victims with domestic workers who might have witnessed related criminal activity by the perpetrators' families. The network she's building spans 6 states and has already provided evidence that helped convict 4 different wealthy drunk drivers whose cases were headed toward plea bargains or acquittals. This is what I never expected when I decided to speak up about Bradley Morrison's hit and run, the exponential effect of choosing courage over comfort. Every person who finds the strength to tell their truth makes it easier for the next person to speak up. Every conviction of a wealthy criminal proves to other working people that the system can work, sometimes, if enough ordinary people refuse to stay silent. I'm 70 now, 5 years older, and hopefully 5 years wiser than the woman who first grabbed Richard Morrison's throat. My hair's completely gray. My arthritis makes cleaning work more difficult, but my voice is stronger than it's ever been. I speak at conferences, testify before legislative committees, provide consultation to law enforcement agencies investigating white-collar crime. Next month, I'm flying to Washington, D.C. to meet with senators who are considering a federal domestic workers' bill of rights. The meeting was arranged by Congresswoman Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, who read my story and invited me to testify before the House Subcommittee on Economic Disparity and Fairness in Growth. Your case proves that the people who clean our offices and raise our children and secure our buildings are often the only witnesses to crimes that would otherwise go unpunished, she told me during our preliminary phone call. We need to protect them, not just because it's morally right, but because they are often the only ones who can protect the rest of us from wealthy criminals who think money makes them untouchable. The federal legislation would create new legal protections for all household workers, not just those who witness crimes. Mandatory written contracts, protection from retaliation, access to unemployment benefits, the right to organize collectively for better working conditions. It would also establish a federal office to investigate crimes reported by domestic workers and coordinate with state and local law enforcement to ensure those cases receive appropriate attention. The bill faces opposition from wealthy constituencies who argue that regulating household employment would burden families who rely on domestic help. But I've learned something about political opposition over the past 5 years. Wealthy people are used to getting their way through quiet lobbying and campaign contributions. They're not used to public debates where their opponents have personal stories that resonate with working families. They can hire expensive lobbyists to argue that domestic worker protection hurts the economy. But they can't hire anyone to argue against Rosa Martinez, who worked without a written contract for 8 families and never received overtime pay despite working 70 hours a week. They can't hire anyone to argue against Jennifer Washington, who witnessed campaign finance violations but stayed silent for 3 years because she needed health insurance for her diabetic daughter. The congressional hearings will be my biggest platform yet to tell this story, to explain why domestic workers' rights aren't just about labor law, they're about democracy itself. When working people are too afraid to report crimes committed by their wealthy employers, when economic insecurity forces ordinary citizens to become accomplices to corruption, our entire system of justice becomes compromised. But I keep coming back to the personal dimension of this fight, to the individual faces and stories that motivated me to speak up in the first place. Mrs. Elena Vasquez, who turned her trauma into advocacy for other victims of drunk driving. Maria Santos, whose mother's courage inspired her to become a social worker. Sarah Chen, whose keen observation skills and moral courage proved that security guards see everything, understand everything, and deserve respect for their role in keeping communities safe. These women didn't start as activists or advocates or reformers. They started as working people who were tired of being invisible, tired of being taken advantage of, tired of watching wealthy people escape consequences for behavior that would land ordinary people in prison. They found their voices because someone, in this case me, had shown them it was possible to speak up and survive, possible to fight back and win. That's what I want you to understand if you're listening to this story while working a night shift somewhere, while cleaning someone else's house or office or building, while taking care of someone else's children or parents or business. You are not as powerless as you think. Your voice matters more than you know. Your courage, when you find it, will inspire courage in others. The wealthy and powerful count on your silence, your fear, your economic insecurity. They've built their empires on the assumption that working people will always choose survival over justice, comfort over confrontation, keeping your job over keeping your integrity. Sometimes that calculation is correct. Sometimes the cost of speaking up really is too high, the consequences too severe, the likelihood of success too small. I don't judge anyone who makes the difficult choice to stay silent when staying silent means keeping food on the table and a roof over their families' heads. But sometimes, more often than you might think, speaking up is safer than staying silent. Sometimes the people you're protecting don't deserve protection. Sometimes the crimes you're witnessing are serious enough that your testimony can prevent future victims. Sometimes your voice, combined with other voices, can bring down entire criminal enterprises built on the assumption that working people don't matter. How do you know when that moment has arrived? How do you recognize the difference between ordinary workplace mistreatment and criminal behavior that demands moral courage? Start by trusting your instincts. If something feels wrong, it probably is wrong. If your employer's behavior makes you uncomfortable, there's probably a good reason. If you find yourself thinking, this can't be legal, it probably isn't legal. Document everything you can safely document. Dates, times, conversations, financial records you observe while cleaning or organizing. Keep your notes at home, not at work. Use your personal phone to take pictures, not your work phone. Build a record that law enforcement can use, but build it carefully and protect yourself. Find allies among your co-workers, other household employees, anyone else who might have witnessed similar behavior. Criminal enterprises rarely limit their crimes to one victim or one employee witness. There are almost always other people who've seen pieces of the puzzle. Research the legal protections available to you: whistleblower laws, worker protection statutes, immigration policies that protect witnesses to crimes regardless of their legal status. Many working people don't report crimes because they don't understand their rights, don't know about the protections that exist to help people in their situation. Connect with organizations that support domestic workers, immigrant workers, low-wage workers. You don't have to fight alone, and you don't have to figure out the legal system by yourself. There are people and organizations whose entire mission is helping workers in exactly your situation. Most importantly, remember that speaking up is not just about the immediate crime you've witnessed. It's about the pattern of behavior that crime represents, the future victims you might protect, the message you send to other wealthy criminals who think their money makes them untouchable. When I decided to report the Morrison family's crimes, I wasn't just seeking justice for Mrs. Elena Vasquez, though her injuries were certainly motivation enough. I was also thinking about all the other elderly tenants who might be evicted, all the other small business owners who might be cheated, all the other families who might be hurt by drunk drivers whose parents could afford expensive lawyers. One voice speaking truth to power can seem small, insignificant, easily ignored or dismissed. But when that voice is heard, when that testimony leads to justice, when that courage inspires others to find their own voices, the impact spreads like ripples in a pond. The Morrison case generated dozens of copycat investigations across the country. The Domestic Workers Justice Coalition has helped pass legislation protecting household employees in 12 states. The FBI's White-Collar Crime Division has received over 3,000 tips from domestic workers in the 5 years since Bradley Morrison's conviction, leading to prosecutions that have recovered hundreds of millions of dollars in stolen assets and prevented countless future crimes. But the most important impact remains individual and personal. Every domestic worker who finds the courage to report wage theft or criminal activity by their employer. Every family that changes how they treat their household, help after learning about workers' rights. Every wealthy person who thinks twice before committing crimes because they remember that someone is always watching, someone is always listening, and working people's voices matter. Which brings me to you, whoever you are, wherever you're listening to this story. What's the choice you're facing that requires moral courage? What's the injustice you're witnessing that needs a voice? What's the crime or corruption or abuse of power that you're uniquely positioned to expose? Maybe you're not a domestic worker. Maybe you're a security guard who's seen financial crimes, a hospital worker who's witnessed insurance fraud, or a retail employee who's observed wage theft. Maybe you're a contractor who's been asked to cut corners that violate building codes, a bookkeeper who's been told to falsify records, or a driver who's been instructed to transport suspicious cargo. The specific industry doesn't matter. The principle remains the same. Ordinary working people are often the only witnesses to extraordinary crimes, and working people's voices, when they find the courage to speak, can bring justice that expensive lawyers and political connections can't prevent. I spent 20 years in the military learning about honor, duty, and service to something greater than myself. But it took until I was 64 years old, working as a janitor for a family that treated me like invisible furniture, to truly understand what those concepts meant in civilian life. Honor isn't about medals or commendations. It's about making choices that align with your deepest values, regardless of the cost. Duty isn't about following orders. It's about protecting people who can't protect themselves, even when those people are strangers. Service isn't about wearing a uniform. It's about using whatever power you have, however small, to make the world a little more just. You have more power than you think. Your voice carries more weight than you know. Your courage, when you find it, will inspire courage in others. Don't let anyone convince you that working people don't matter, that ordinary voices aren't worth hearing, that economic insecurity disqualifies you from demanding justice. The wealthy and powerful need ordinary people to do their work, clean their houses, raise their children, secure their buildings, handle their money. That need gives you access to information, gives you the ability to witness their crimes, gives you the opportunity to speak truth to power when the moment arrives. Will you be ready when that moment comes? Will you have the courage to choose justice over job security, truth over comfort, protecting future victims over protecting your own financial stability? I can't answer those questions for you. I can only tell you that the cost of speaking up, in my experience, was far less than the cost of staying silent. I can only promise that you're stronger and more capable than you think, that support exists when you need it, that ordinary people really can change the world when they refuse to accept extraordinary injustice. The story I've told you today started with hands around my throat, with a moment of physical intimidation designed to remind me of my place in the social hierarchy. It ends with those same hands typing testimony that brought down a criminal empire, writing legislation that protects vulnerable workers, and reaching out to help other people find their own voices. That transformation didn't happen overnight, and it didn't happen without cost. But it happened because I finally understood that being invisible was a choice, that being powerless was an illusion, and that silence in the face of injustice makes you complicit in that injustice. You don't have to be a veteran to find courage. You don't have to be exceptional to make an extraordinary difference. You just have to be tired enough of being treated poorly, disgusted enough by what you're witnessing, and hopeful enough to believe that speaking up might actually matter. It does matter. You matter. Your voice has power, your integrity has value, and your courage can change more than you imagine. Share your story in the comments below. Tell us about a time you stood up for what was right, even when it was hard. Tell us about someone who believed in you when you couldn't believe in yourself. Tell us about the moment you realized your voice had power. If this story moved you, please like and subscribe. It helps this message reach other people who work hard behind the scenes, who give their best effort to families and employers who rarely say thank you. To continue this journey of finding strength in the stories that matter, we've created a special podcast with tales just as emotionally powerful. You can find it here, on the left. Thank you for listening to my story, for believing that an old janitor's voice was worth hearing. I'll see you in the next story, where we'll continue exploring the courage it takes to stand up for what's right, no matter the cost. Until then, remember, you are stronger than they think, and you are stronger than you think. Your integrity is not for sale, your dignity is not negotiable, and your voice has the power to change the world, one truth at a time.